classics, and her most recent academic monograph is Fictions of Presence, Theatre and Novel in 18th-Century Britain. But this book is ideal Christmas present material, Jane Austen's Fashion Bible. She's going to talk about it and then take some questions, and then there are copies for sale outside, which you can get signed if you want to. But Ros, it's lovely to have you here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Helen. So thank you so much for coming, particularly on Halloween. I've been trying to find some Halloween-themed dress, but it wasn't a thing in the 1790s and 1810s, I'm afraid, so I haven't got much to show you. I have something that might pick up the idea. As Helen said, on September the 11th, not the most auspicious date to choose, but my first book was published, that's been written for general readers. I've written academic books. And this, I think, is a little miracle of design. It was published by Macmillan. It's lovely to have my editor here, Harriet, who sold me on the idea of doing the work for it, and I really enjoyed working on it. And they even indulged me by, those of you who know me well, know that my eventual plan is to write a book about ginger people. So I was delighted to get a ginger on the cover. So it's called Jane Austen's Fashion Bible. It provides extracts from Jane Austen's writings alongside colour illustrations from a journal of the early 19th century called La Belle Assemblée. So the beautiful people, I suppose, or beautiful company. And La Belle Assemblée was a sort of vogue of its time, so I'll talk a bit more about that journal as I go along. So you have colour illustrations like this one, which is from La Belle Assemblée, alongside reproductions of what was called the explanations of fashion that were printed with the illustrations. And then there's a little short explanatory piece by me in each chapter about fashion and Austen, linking the fashion illustration with some of Austen's writing. And the idea was to kind of bring to life key scenes from Austen's writing in these beautiful colour plates. When I was a child, I loved Cicely Barker's Flower Fairies, and I loved the Cinderella Ladybird. So I thought, and I spent long hours pondering those images alongside the texts that I was reading. So I thought, and so I'm hoping it will serve that kind of purpose for readers as well. Today, I'm going to introduce you to the book by talking about the kind of design talents of Jane Austen and the major contributor or editor to this fashion journal, who is a woman called Mary Ann Bell. So you may know Austen. I'm going to introduce you to Mary Ann Bell. Remarkably, Mary Ann Bell seems to have debuted in print in La Belle Assemblée in the same month and year as Jane Austen saw her first book into print. So you can see here the image of the front cover of Sense and Sensibility, and by the side of it, the explanation of the Prince of Fashion for November 1811. La Belle Assemblée was always published in 1 month to look forward to the fashions for the next. So the fashions for November 1811 are printed in October, in the October number. So you can be ready with your clothing. So Mary Ann Bell, I'll come back to that. Mary Ann Bell was 10 years younger than Austen. We think her first column was in October 1811, and it's introducing fashion for November 1811. And the description she gives is one of my favourite designs. Unfortunately, we don't have the engraved illustration for this outfit. And that's partly because if you know anything about fashion journals, you might know the V&A has a lovely collection, for instance, that people cut them out. They strip them out of the journal and put them into their own scrapbooks and things. So often we can't find the corresponding image. There are several runs, usually in black and white, but I couldn't find one for this. But it is one of my favourite designs. It's a comet dress, which was meant to suggest the great comet of that year, 1811. It was first visible in March. It was visible for 260 days, and in October, it was particularly bright. So this is my one concession to Halloween, a comet dress from October 1811. It had a sort of starry headdress, or it's described as having a starry headdress, and pointy cape sleeves. And you can see here as well that it was particularly bright over Winchester, and there's an engraving by H.R. Cook from that period in that October. There are other products that were launched to link with the comet. Those of you who like champagne might like to know that Madame Clicquot launched a cuvée de comet that year as well. Interestingly, Mary Ann Bell says she hopes that it's going to survive longer than a comet. She says, such fashions as these are merely local, but the elegance and taste of both the hat and mantle are unrivalled, and we think it a pity they had not a title which might not have rendered them more durable favourites of the approaching winter. So, yeah, shame it's called comet, because comets don't last. By winter it'll be over. So a nice sort of comment on fashion and its ephemerality. Mary Ann was the daughter-in-law of the proprietor of La Belle Assemblée. She married her husband in 1806. Her husband, John, has the same name as her father-in-law, John Bell. John had had a falling out with his father because he launched a rival journal. The pair, father and son, seem to have made up in 1810, and Mary Ann Bell seems to have moved in quite quickly to secure a spot writing for the magazine now that her husband and father were sorted. Mary Ann's style as a writer and designer was particularly attractive, I think. It was kind of playful and creative, and reading through those columns, you can hear that she must have felt like a kind of breath of fresh air in comparison with the commentator before, who sounds to me a little bit like Mr. Collins, rather dull and tedious and pedantic. And you can see, I think, the resemblance, or for me, there's a resemblance to Jane Austen's entry into print, into the world of publishing. Jane Austen was 36 when she entered Mary Ann in her about 26. Both women, I want to suggest, knew how to handle their materials in ways that made people feel they were immersed in a new and complete world, and a world through which they'd be guided with great care through the tensions of making wise choices that would set them off to advantage. So there's a sort of similar promise to help guide the reader to make the right choice that will show them at their best. And I'm going to talk a bit more about how the journal was promoted at its start. So the first number of La Belle Assemblée has this column called The Beau Monde, or Belle's Court and Fashionable Magazine. And this is how the journal was introduced, promising to lead its reader through the world of fashion. We shall furnish him with a chart that will govern his voyage in all the varieties of the course. We shall begin from the very point of embarkation. He will, readers are always described as he will see a young country girl with decent manners, good morals, and a careful education enter upon a fashionable course. And I think there about the fact that so many of Austen's novels are also these kind of young girls who've come from the country who are entering into fashion and trying to navigate it. He will see her carried through the different scenes of the beau monde and guided by a gay, seducing, artful woman of fashion. He will perceive that the patroness understands her work and is competent to the undertaking. She will point out examples instead of giving precepts, and presenting scenes and characters leave her young pupil to draw her own inferences. In one word, and what includes the whole art of instruction, she does not teach her pupil, but leaves her more wisely to instruct herself. And again, you might think of parallels with what we admire about Jane Austen's writing. Not a kind of finger-wagging didacticism, but a kind of way of leading her reader through to ethical conclusions on the basis of evidence, which makes you as a reader feel as though you got there yourself, rather than being told where to reach a conclusion. So in 1806, Jane Austen had turned 30, only 2 months earlier. Her birthday's in December. 1805 had been a very tough year for the Austen family. Her beloved father had died in that year, in January. And she was now in an all-female household consisting of 2 unmarried daughters, Jane and her older sister Cassandra. Those of you who know Austen will remember that famous comment by her slightly unsympathetic mother, saying that if Jane would do anything to be like Cassandra, and if Cassandra chopped off her head, Jane Austen would chop off her head as well. As a second daughter, I know that feeling. Do anything your older sister does. Okay, so she's in an all-female household, 2 unmarried daughters, their mother and their friend Martha Lloyd. And they're trying to come to terms with their grief and escape the fashionable watering place of Bath. They moved out in July and they toured the south of England before arriving to lodgings in Southampton in the autumn of 1806, where they stayed for some time with a younger naval brother. Eventually, one of Austen's many brothers, she only had one sister, but many brothers, and the most affluent one, Edward Knight, offered them a home in the bailiff's cottage near his estate at Chawton village in Hampshire. Edward had been adopted into the Knight family, who didn't have a male heir, and he was running 3 estates for the Knight family and eventually inherited them. I always think that the brothers got together and said, what are we going to do? Well, and they said, well, let's offer them a home. Edward offered them a choice of one of these 3 estates. I think probably Jane and Cassandra chose Chawton because it was the one that Edward and his many, many children didn't visit so often. And if you're an unmarried daughter, you have to do a lot of childcare for your brother's children. So they probably thought they'd get a bit more peace and quiet at Chawton. And they moved in on 7th of July, 1809. Jane Austen may have drawn on that experience in describing the Dashwood woman moving into Barton Cottage in Sense and Sensibility. Jane, of course, had been writing fiction since she was a child. There were lively short pieces of comic satire that she worked up into kind of mock volumes to entertain her family. There was a satirical little novel which had at its centre, written in letters, a woman called Lady Susan, who is just such a kind of gay, seducing, artful woman of fashion, as we've heard introduced as a kind of guide to La Belle Assemblée. Austen, Jane, had sold a complete novel to the publisher Benjamin Crosby in spring 1803, but it hadn't been published. She'd already written first versions of what were to become Sense and Sensibility. The earliest version is something called Eleanor and Marianne. We don't have it, but Cassandra knows that, tells us that's what it was called. And she'd written a version of Pride and Prejudice called First Impressions. Those had been drafted in 1795 and 1796. But here we are in 1809. She's now got a forever home. She's moving out of her 20s. She's single, and she's facing towards a career as a published novelist. And the following years in Chawton saw extraordinary productivity, with 4 mature and brilliant novels put into print to some critical success, if not explosive popularity, before her untimely death at the age of 41 of an undetermined illness on the 18th of July, 1817. One factoid I often tell people, which I think is sort of slightly heartbreaking, is that Austen earned about £700 in the course of her lifetime from her writing. We think how much money people have made on Austen since. The sort of global profits that have come from it. In my small way, I'm paying back some of those profits in that the royalties from this book will go to Chawton House, the big house in Chawton, which is now a heritage centre and a women's library. Now, it may be that the women in the Austen household found some comfort and entertainment in these difficult times around 1806 to 1809, looking at the fashion plates and discussing the fashions in that new monthly La Belle Assemblée, as do contemporary readers of high fashion magazines. So even when we're not part of that world, many of us read Vogue, but we're not going to be able to buy the outfits in Vogue, and we lack the funds to purchase them. In the letters that survive, Jane and her correspondents don't mention La Belle Assemblée, or this kind of reading. Jane was always a reader and avid defender of the modern novel. She doesn't talk about fashion journals. But we do know that in the Knight family books at Chawton House, there's an 1814 volume of La Belle Assemblée, which was owned by Fanny Knight, one of their favourite nieces, well, their favourite niece. Fanny, of course, had been born into a much more well-heeled family, the brothers' family that had those estates. Genteel but not affluent women, such as her Aunt Jane, even if they couldn't commission high fashion from modistes, were necessarily preoccupied, though, with clothing. Everything had to be made or mended. They had to pay for their clothes to be made up by dressmakers. But also there's a lot of mending and updating of clothes at their own hands. Jane mentions in letters several makers, Miss Burton in 1811, Miss Summers in 1800, Mrs. Mussell in 1801, the Miss Bakers in 1808, and Miss Hare 1813, who made a cap. And I love a letter, there's a letter from 1798 to Cassandra when she says she's not sure about a design for her new gown. And she says, anticipating Primark, I wish such things were to be bought ready-made. So there's a certain amount of impatience with clothing, but also having to look genteel, having to look neat and tidy, that is everywhere in the letters. In the accounts Jane kept of 1807, in the back of a diary, her largest area of expense, 27.4%, was on clothing and pocket, with laundry a close second at 18.3%. Fantastic book by Hilary Davidson called Jane Austen's Wardrobe gives you that information. When Jane Austen refers to clothing in her letters, and we only have about 5% of the total she probably wrote, because Cassandra destroyed many of them, she talked about clothing not only in terms of domestic economy, but also reflecting on what's fashionable or what can be made to be so. She and her sister Cassandra exchanged vigorous correspondence about buying suitable lengths of material for having their dresses made up, what they should wear at balls and parties, about trimming bonnets, always with a kind of eye to thrift alongside elegance. So they were talking a lot more about clothing in the letters than we hear in the novels. Characters on tight budgets in the novels are often shown finding means to aspire to fashion. You might think of the Steele sisters, who stay with the privileged and wealthy Lady Middleton, Lucy and Anne. They're described as taking patterns of some elegant new dress in which her appearance the day before had thrown them into unceasing delight. So these two sisters are vulgar sycophants who are trying to take a pattern, was to take a gown as a model and then copy it in a fabric to make a pattern for a new one using cotton or lining or linen fabric. So this, in that reference, this is more a satire about sycophancy than it is praise of domestic economy. And she's very short on detail about what her heroines wear. It's usually a sign of silliness or vulgarity when a woman starts to rattle on about fashion in Austen. And it's often mocked by men such as Henry Tilney or Fitzwilliam Darcy, who are deemed suitable matches for Austen's heroines. And as I said, they're often themselves country girls who are kind of finding their way in the new worlds of the beau monde. We, as Austen readers, have as our guide through these stories, though, a woman who, like the putative patroness of La Belle Assemblée, knows her art and is guiding us through the stories without being tendentious, authoritarian, or tedious, albeit not someone who is actually a woman of fashion. Now, designing and making texts and textiles is quite an intricate craft, and it's most successful when it dresses its subject to advantage rather than shows off its own labour. So whether you're a modiste or a novelist, it's your job to make the person you're presenting look natural and at their best, rather than to show off your own work. And I think Austen knew that well, as did Mary Ann Bell. Both give us a sense that they're inviting us into real lives. Of course, they're often indulging outrageous fantasies of romance. And it's been commented that, it's very unlikely that a woman of Eliza Bennet's financial situation would secure property-rich Mr. Darcy at his $10,000 a year. And similarly, we'll come back to this, the kind of impossibly slender figures of the women in La Belle Assemblée, as we all know, are not the figures that most of us walk about with in contemporary fashion then or now. So there's a shared aesthetic achievement in the fashion journal among the makers whose skill it showcased, and the fiction that Austen spun about women's lives. So when I was doing the book, I was finding engravings to illustrate the fashions of the time and to visualise some of Austen's most striking scenes and characters. Along the way, we look at choices available in terms of textile and style, whether according to season, to place, or activity. And the book starts with samples from her earliest teenage writings, traces the fashion disasters and triumphs in her major works, and finishes looking out with Sanditon at a fashionable seaside resort at her own vanishing prospects of health. Now, to be fashionable in this period wasn't just to be well-dressed, it was also to be well-read and well-informed. So if you can see this slide here, you can see the contents of the first number of the magazine, February 1806. The magazine included regular features that covered contemporary biography, extracts from fiction, poetry, music, reviews, news concerning politics and theatre. It always contained, though, at least 2 fashion plates and explanations about those fashions and fashions in general. Readers could purchase the 2 parts separately. The first contained largely print materials of that kind, sort of general information articles, and the second consisted of the fashion plates, sometimes a sewing pattern, with up to 4 pages of description of fashion and what was called, I always loved, general observations on fashion and dress. So you can see here, we're told it's enriched with portraits of the costumes of fashionable dresses of London and Paris for each month, drawn by artists of the first celebrity for their taste and accuracy of delineation, and occasionally with engraved representation of new articles of ornament or curious devices which should be worn at court or in polite circles of polished life, with appropriate and interesting descriptions, and also elegant patterns for embroidery, tambour, or needlework. Didn't usually provide patterns to make up full clothing. Women's magazines of the 18th century, there's a journal called the Ladies' Magazine, which got kind of outraged letters when they started putting in paper patterns. Because people saying, you know, we're not at the class where we need paper patterns. You know, somebody else does that. So, now its first fashion plates were not coloured, but from November 1806, you could buy La Belle Assemblée in 2 forms, uncoloured at 2 shillings 6pence or hand-coloured at 3 shillings 6pence. The journal employed the best fashion artists in England, including the portrait painter Arthur William Devis and John and William Hopwood, but many of the plates were anonymous and many were copies of French ones. The proprietor, John Bell, seems to have thought, first of all, that he was going to be encouraging the women who read the magazine to develop their capacities as colourers. So he said he'd hoped to give them an opportunity of practicing and improving their taste in the fine arts by themselves colouring the prints. And the other reason he says he does this, which makes sense, I think, if you work in art, is that he says you keep the clarity of line if you've got a black and white engraving, whereas you lose it if you're with colour. But he gave in because of rival magazines and had to offer them the opportunity to purchase them coloured, which you can see at the bottom. To gratify such as may prefer the prints coloured in a proper and high-finished style, we shall prepare a number of copies in that manner. And you could get it delivered for 4 shillings, so you're paying 3 shillings 6pence plus delivery. The next number, he says, kind of interestingly, and I think it is worth thinking about the 19th century being a century in which technology around producing colour really starts to take off, and it's here too in these magazines. The next number, he says, will be enriched in a very extraordinary style with a transparent and lucid print in colours as a specimen of the fashionable and very interesting mode of colouring prints to represent the effects of stained glass. So he's talking here about transparency, which was a technique introduced in the 1790s. You add varnish from both sides to the highlights of an image you've painted on a paper or on a light textile, and that makes the material translucent when it's held up against the light, resembling stained glass. And here too, I thought, I might be fanciful here, but I like to think about the parallels between Austen's art and this kind of technique. The idea that you're sort of looking through the print to the shape of a real body behind it. So the magazine then is being designed to sort of piece together an elegant woman from all of this matter and to bring her to life in vivid colour. And elegance is a word that Austen uses a lot in her writing. She describes Mrs. Weston in Emma, the woman who was Emma's much-loved governess and then marries a local gentleman, as having manners with propriety, simplicity, and elegance. It's a word that we hear a lot in La Belle Assemblée as well, often used to sort of say this is going to be the most elegant fashion. It's very often heard in the general observations on fashion and dress. So I want to go back to Mary Ann Bell and introduce you to a bit more of her. Mary Ann Bell's style was very distinctive, as I said. She's very energetic, vivid. She's very cheerfully flattering of her audience as well. She lights up and colours the pages of the magazine from October 1811 until John Bell Sr. retired in 1821. She had a good eye to the market, so she set up her own salon in early 1814 at 22 Upper King Street, and a few months later moved to Charlotte Street. She seems to have had a particular genius for inventing new designs, and I've given you two here that I rather like. One of them, the little black and white one down the corner here, is a thing she called the chapeau bras, the arm hat. It's a kind of face-framing hat with something that looks like arms. It was large enough to cover your hair and any other decoration. It could conceal a woman's face from public prying, but she could still look out. But it was also soft enough to fold into your reticule. Very handy piece of furniture. The other design that I'm particularly taken by is the Circassian corset, which she introduced in 1814. She had herself had her first child in 1813, and she designs an unboned corset for ladies after pregnancy. If you've been pregnant, you know you want something with a bit of softness and give. The other thing I really love about this illustration, and I haven't seen much like this, is the idea that I think she's suggesting that you could breastfeed in this outfit. And again, if you're someone who's had children, you know that you want to have something that you can lift up to breastfeed, rather than lifting your breast out. It's for discreet breastfeeding. Okay. The other one I'm particularly fond of is the Bathing Preserver, September 1814. This is a long dress with an attached cap of light materials which you could carry in a silk bag to the sea. And she says this is designed particularly to relieve ladies from the nauseous idea of wearing the bathing coverings furnished by the women at the seaside, from which dangerous permanent illnesses have arisen, in consequence of their being worn by all kinds of persons, however they be afflicted. So you can imagine you get to the seaside and some horrible piece of clothing that you can hire, that several women have worn before you. Mrs. Bell's bathing preserver is made quite in a novel manner, to which is attached a cap to be removed at pleasure, made of a delicate oil silk that keeps the head dry. Sorry, that's my typo. Okay. I'm going to finish just by talking to you briefly about 3 illustrations from Jane Austen's Fashion Bible to get a sense of the kind of conversation I was trying to establish between the designs that the journal had on its reader and the designs that Austen has on us as readers of her novels. So here's one of the chapters I called Pugs and Pelisses, or Pelisses. The only garment that survives of Jane Austen's is this brown silk pelisse she acquired sometime between 1812 and August 1814. So it's here. She mentions it in August 1814 in a letter to Cassandra. It probably then dates from the period when she was writing Mansfield Park. A pelisse is a straight coat which is closed in front with a tie. We know Jane Austen was tall because she quite often writes to Cassandra saying, "You're going to need extra material for me." This pelisse gives us a sense that she was probably about 5'8", which is tall for a woman in this period. And she was also thin as a rake, so this kind of long, straight coat would have looked rather dramatic. And it obviously was a very expensive and fashionable piece. Austen's was patterned with falling oak leaves in gold and adorned with silk cord. The pelisse in the illustration I chose is described as decorated with acorn tassels, so the same autumnal acorns and oaks, and ornamented with silver frogs. I was particularly delighted to find a lady in a brown pelisse with a small dog playing at her heels. Those of you who know Mansfield Park will know why. Lady Bertram, who takes Fanny into her household, has a strong preference for her pug dogs over everyone else in the household. And here we are introduced to Lady Bertram. She'd been a beauty, and a prosperous beauty, all her life. And beauty and wealth were all that excited her respect. So we're at a point in the novel where Fanny Price has been proposed to by Henry Crawford. I don't want to do too many spoilers, but for those of you who don't know Austen, I'm always jealous of people who haven't read Austen yet. But Fanny turns down Henry Crawford, who's a good marriage from her. Fanny's a sort of poor niece. So Lady Bertram, to know Fanny to be sought in marriage by a man of fortune, raised Fanny, therefore, very much in her opinion, by convincing her that Fanny was very pretty, which she'd been doubting about before, and that she would be advantageously married. It made her feel a sort of credit in calling her niece. "I will tell you what," Fanny said she, "I'm sure he fell in love with you at the ball. I'm sure the mischief was done that evening. You did look remarkably well. Everybody said so. Sir Thomas," that's her husband, said so. "And you know you had Chapman to help you dress," presumably her servant. "I'm very glad I sent Chapman to you. I shall tell Sir Thomas that I'm sure it was done that evening." And still pursuing the same cheerful thoughts, she soon afterwards added, "And I tell you what, Fanny, which is more than I did for Maria," her daughter, "the next time Pug has a litter, you shall have a puppy." Now, in my commentary, I focus on the pug as a kind of accessory, a fashion accessory. And note that Jane rarely describes what her characters are wearing, but she does provide them with accessories that communicate their personality. And in the case of Lady Bertram, she's always accompanied by a dog of a similar type to herself, the pug. Pugs were bred in China to adorn the laps of Chinese sovereigns during the Shang dynasty around 4000 BC. So they are, like Lady Bertram, creatures of indolence. There's also something a little bit sinister going on here. People have talked about lap dogs. They sit on your lap. That's the place, if you like, of reproduction for women. She's also anticipating Fanny having a child and saying, "You will get a puppy." So she's a slightly kind of, a slightly sort of vulgar, pointing towards that reproductive opportunity. And if you want to read more, there's a wonderful book about muffs in the 18th century. And their symbolic meanings. I won't say more now. Okay. My next example, let's start now with the text that we use. This is one of Jane Austen's letters to Cassandra. So we're in 1813 now. She's writing from Godmersham Park, which is one of the estates of Edward Knight. So she's staying there. And this is her writing to her sister. "My dearest Cassandra, having half an hour before breakfast, very snug, in my own room, lovely morning, excellent fire, fancy me, I'll give you some account of the last 2 days. And yet what is there to be told? I shall get foolishly minute unless I cut the matter short." I've cut this long letter short, just to get you to the point of it. "By the by, as I must leave off being young," so she's now a mature woman, she can't be young, she's not a young sort of pretty thing, I find many douceurs in being a sort of chaperone, for I'm put on the sofa near the fire and can drink as much wine as I like. We had music in the evening, Fanny and Miss Wildman played, and Mr. James Wildman sat close by and listened, or pretended to listen. It was 12 before we reached home. We were all dog-tired, but pretty well today. Miss Clews says she hasn't caught cold, and Fanny's does not seem worse. I was so tired, Fanny Knight, that's her niece, I was so tired that I began to wonder how I should get through the ball next Thursday, but there will be so much variety then in walking about, and probably so much less heat, then perhaps I may not feel it more. My china crepe is still kept for the ball. Enough of the concert. So I have a chapter called Crepe Expectations, and it looks at the fashions for June 1813. That's just a few months before she wrote this letter, in November 1813. Although she's 38 and she's leaving off being young, she's still got a kind of busy social life, attending a concert, and she's especially planning her dress for an upcoming ball, which is this china crepe. Now, this wasn't the crepe that was reserved for mourning, sort of heavy material, but it was kind of silk woven in India or China, as I understand it. And both Jane and Cassandra were proud possessors of dresses in this very lightweight textile, possibly brought back to them by their sailor brother Francis from a trip from Canton to England via Madras in 1810. We know that Francis bought a skein of crepe back for his sisters-in-law. So we think it's very likely he also bought it back for them. So here we've got the fashions for June 1813, including a frock of straw-coloured crepe. The general observations given with it noted that for full dress, crepe is universal. The frock which you have given in our plate is the first in estimation. So everyone's wearing crepe, so is Austen. Austen reported in a letter of 5th of March 1814 that she decided to trim a lilac sarcenet dress with the same black satin ribbon that features on her china crepe. So I kind of liked the choice here because we've got these little ribbons down the back that for me sort of echo that sense that Austen had decorated her china crepe with ribbon, although hers was black and here it's white. And I think we might also note, both from the letter and from this image or illustration or engraving, that what's being sought as an effect is a kind of mature elegance, which she's thinking about in her own imagination of herself. And my last example is from Emma. When I was putting together the book, I'd really hoped to find kind of great matches between the action in the book, the action in the novel, and that moment in La Belle Assemblée. But that did actually prove quite difficult, you might find a date that coincided, but the illustration wasn't interesting. So I prioritised finding illustrations that would help to illustrate very striking scenes in Austen. But sometimes serendipity does happen, and it did here. And I think probably because there were important associations in Austen's mind. So if we look first at the extract, the prose extract, in Emma, there's a ball that Emma and Frank Churchill plan at the Crown Inn in the country town of Highbury. And that ball takes place, we're told, on a May evening in 1814. And at the ball, things are kind of coming to a head in the dynamics between the young people. The whole passage is told rather magnificently through Emma's point of view, focalised through Emma. Emma was smiling with enjoyment, delighted to see the respectable length of the set as it was forming, and to feel that she had so many hours of unusual festivity before her. She was more disturbed by Mr. Knightley's not dancing than by anything else. There he was, among the standers-by, where he ought not to be. He ought to be dancing. You can hear Emma there, she's bossy. Not classing himself with the husbands and fathers and whist players who were pretending to feel an interest in the dance till their rubbers were made up, so young as he looked. So she's already starting to think, oh, he's not as old as he seems. He might be a prospect, talking herself into it. He couldn't have appeared to greater advantage perhaps anywhere than where he placed himself. His tall, firm, upright figure among the bulky forms and stooping shoulders of the elderly men was such as Emma felt must draw everybody's eyes. Well, we know whose eyes are being drawn here. And excepting her own partner, there was not one among the whole row of young men who could be compared with him. Her partner is Frank Churchill. He moved a few steps nearer, and those few steps were enough to prove in how gentlemanlike a manner, with what natural grace he must have danced, would he but take the trouble. Whenever she caught his eye, she forced him to smile, but in general he was looking grave. She wished he could love a ballroom better, and could like Frank Churchill better. He seemed often observing her, so we've got that clue there. You know, one of my colleagues once said, Mr. Knightley is just a jealous man. He's always watching her. She mustn't flatter herself that he thought of her dancing, but if he were criticising her behaviour, she didn't feel afraid. There was nothing like flirtation between her and her partner. They seemed more like cheerful, easy friends than lovers. That Frank Churchill thought less of her than he had done was indubitable. So there's something going on here where Emma is both making us aware of her feelings, but she's also noting the kind of alliances, the kind of micropolitics of what's going on in the ball. Recognising and coming to a kind of understanding that she's not as interested in Frank as she thought she was, that he's not as interested in her, that she's... and we're becoming aware of her loyalty or her interest in Mr. Knightley. The micropolitics of this ball, I suggest in my little commentary, point to the larger politics of enmity and alliance in Europe at this time. In June 1813, the Duke of Wellington led an army to victory against the French at Vittoria. On the 20th of April, Napoleon bade farewell to his troops and set out for exile on Elba. Wellington was a hero, and he comes back to England, and there were celebrations across the country. And La Belle Assemblée in May 1814 is suggesting fashions for June 1814 in its May number. and it's particularly suggesting fashions for the balls that are going to be held to celebrate Wellington's victory against Napoleon and the French. So I found this lovely pink and white ball dress. It's topped with a Wellington laurel wreath of a white or green foil. And it seems to me a very lovely image to capture Emma's energy and charm, as well as her increasingly shrewd powers of observation at this point in a novel, and a novel that's all about the tensions between opposing forces in any society. So I think I'd also want to use it to sort of push back against those people who say Austen never talks about politics. She does. She just does it in a way that you might not, in an indirect way. And here, perhaps fashion and recognising what's happening in fashion in response to contemporary politics can point us to that. Okay, I'm just going to stop there just to say that La Belle Assemblée thrived for much longer than Jane Austen. It continued after Belle's retirement through to 1847, under some new titles, but it's the same publication. We might look back now and recognise that Austen's fiction has had a much longer afterlife and posterity. You're all here because you know of Austen, probably not La Belle Assemblée. So Austen's fiction has had a longer afterlife and posterity, despite the fact that she had quite a short comet of a life, dying at 41. What we continue to value in Austen's fiction is, I think, its lightly worn wisdom about human frailty and potential. And I hope what I've said today suggests to you that resourceful female design lay at the heart of Austen's novels and the fashion journals that she may have consulted. Thank you.
Thank you, Ros, for making the material world of Jane Austen come so alive. You know, we're used to it and slightly, yes, the adaptations where people are imposing the fashions of their own time slightly on that 18th century look. I am conscious that people will want to sign books, but I'm sure there will be people wanting to ask questions, so I'm going to open it up to the microphone and see if anyone wants to start off. Yes, I'm here. Switch, wait for the microphone.
Yeah.
I was wondering if there was any particular scene in Austen that kind of kick-started this project, a relationship between fashion and her work that made you interested in...
It's a good question. You might want to ask Harriet, because it was brought to me as a project, really, thinking about it being the 250th anniversary of Austen's birth this year. I suppose what I would say is that it's partly brought to me, I think mainly brought to me because I'm a specialist in Austen. Actually not, well, you might be able to tell from where, I'm not wildly interested in fashion. So I'm much more interested in literature. But I had... one of my earliest books was a co-authored book on women's magazines. So it was called Women's Worlds. And I'd written sections on the 18th Century Journal and spent a lot of time with the ladies' magazine. So I was really interested in periodical writing. I have always been interested in periodical writing of the long 18th century. And I had tended to think mainly about essay writing in the periodical. But I'd also, obviously, in telling that history, we were also telling a history of how the magazine emerges partly from news journalism, but also from those single essay periodicals into this kind of miscellaneous thing, the magazine with lots of material in it. So I'm very interested in that form where you've got a mixture, you have serial fiction alongside descriptions of fashion, paper patterns for doing your own embroidery. So the idea of kind of putting things together from separate pieces. In some ways, I think that's makes it difficult to read Austen alongside them, because I think Austen is so careful to make, these are beautifully shaped novels, do you see? And in a way, I don't think you do read them sort of picking up little bits and then, constructing a version of it. She's taking you through them. So then I thought, well, it would be quite interesting to see how we're being taken through fashion as well. So I don't think there was a single scene. I think there's a sort of similarity in style and tone that I got more and more interested in as I was working on them. Hi, Kirsten.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. And I guess I was interested in the bodies of these, in the illustrations. We talked about the clothes, but they struck me as, do we know any of the reasons why they're rendered as they are with these really disproportionate body parts? So you've got these long,
Yes, someone
thick
said that to me as well.
This really
You've seen her have very big
long-
heads, someone said.
and then tiny feet. I was just curious about what is going on.
Yes, and I realised that actually after various people pointed this out to me, and I thought I must have a very poor visual sense of the human body because it didn't worry me much. I've just started doing some life drawing, and so, I often find I can't fit things on. I've got a sort of a tire-lated shape. I think probably most of it is just about showing off the garments. So, long arms. The shape that you're looking for is that long column shape. But they are very consistent. And I suppose the other thing I would say is that all of the illustrations in the collection and in La Belle Assemblée are of women. So they don't... there are journals that give you men's fashion. Ackerman's is very famous. And we decided to stick with the one journal, and I think that's right because there's a kind of consistency of style that I quite like. I was particularly interested in women's fashion. I did find a lovely picture in Ackerman of a man in very tight breeches with this sort of back turn. I thought, God, that could be Mr. Darcy. All you can see is the shape of his leg. But that would have been a step too far. So, and I think Bell did use a consistent set of artists who were, I think, clearly trying to sort of communicate a kind of brand style, where you could say, and I think I probably could now, if I was looking at V&A collection, say, that's Ackerman's and that's La Belle Assemblée. There's an art historical project there as well, really, about people who are drawing fashion.
Be a sequel coming on. Jane Austen's heroes and those.
Yeah.
Yes, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, I can't see.
It's your job, I'm sorry.
No, I couldn't see the other one. So, there's a hand here and then there's somebody there.
Julia.
So I was interested to hear that you said that there's no mention of the magazines in her work.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts about why that is? Is it because of that tension that's clear there about how important fashion is, but to be seen to be fashionable is to be seen to be vain or frivolous?
No, I agree with you. And in fact, I think, I suppose one of the things I've been reflecting on is it's so consistent now, isn't it? Or inconsistent in the way we talk about fashion. So we talk about people as being slaves to fashion. Do you see that it's somehow something that but really fashionable people are people who seem to be making their own way as dressers, and not following a herd. And even fashion journals themselves are sort of presenting that idea of fashion. And I do think there's a kind of expanded version of the fashionable, which Austen is kind of perhaps playing with, which is to be knowing about those things. So there is a problem in her novels about women's or girls' lack of knowledge. And there is a problem in the romance fiction as a form, too. There's a wonderful book I absolutely love called Loving with a Vengeance by Tanya Modleski, where she talks about romance fiction and sort of says the trouble is that the reader has to know something that the heroine doesn't. You need to have the romance fiction told in a third-person voice, because if the heroine's too knowing about how attractive she is, it's not going to work. If I sort of say, oh, I didn't realise how lovely I looked to Mr. Darcy. So there's a kind of requirement for an innocence or unknowingness that makes you ethically deserving. That too much knowledge will be problematic, but you have to arrive at it by the end of the novel. And perhaps then you have to go and read another romance fiction novel where the heroine starts innocent again. So I think there's a lot of tension around the idea of what it is to be independent of fashion, but also not outside of that social or ethically beyond the pale. Yeah.
So you mentioned this kind of idea of politics and where politics might come into Austen with this passage especially. Do you think, considering like entering the 19th century and the ideas about the private and the public space, especially in the English middle class being quite segregated, is there anything to the idea, in your opinion, that the kind of act of a woman publishing her writing was an act of politics in itself, maybe?
Oh, such a big question. I think I spent a lot of my academic life thinking about that. I mean, I suppose what I would say is I think there is, through the 18th century, there's actually a kind of novelty value in being, or publishing. So Austen publishes her novels as by a lady. And then, so Sense and Sensibility is by a lady, and then Pride and Prejudice is by the author of Sense and Sensibility. So she is admitted, so she's publishing, saying this is by a woman. And then, and the reason that the Brontes say they didn't publish under their own names, and they published under Ellis and Acton, what's the third one? Currabell. Was they said they didn't want to be positively masculine, but they also didn't want to be associated with being female, because there's a kind of expectation of what kind of writing will come from women. But I think there's plenty of market for that. So it's not that you won't do well as a woman, it's just that you'll be read as a woman writer. And I think Austen was, I find Jane Austen kind of interesting, because I think she's actually kind of slightly in a sort of stealth bomber way, sort of lifting the aesthetic achievement of women's writing at the same time as she's being marketed as by a lady, because I think she's a great craftsperson of the novel. And I think she's, in that moment in Northanger Abbey when she says, why do we decry women novels? They're works which sort of delineate human life and are written in the best chosen language. So I think she's kind of raising or uplifting the novel whilst presenting it sort of slightly innocently as a kind of a book by a woman for women. So I suppose it depends where you sit. Do you want... I think probably Austen actually... she does say she's just very pleased to have got money from her books. And that £700 might not sound much, but it was a lot for her, and it made her feel independent. So she tends to say, I'm just pleased to have earned something from it. She doesn't claim to be doing anything aesthetic in her letters, but I think the novels themselves have more ambition than that.
Does anyone tell her back in her letters that she's doing something special? Or do they say, does anyone write back and say, well done, or this is interesting?
Oh, yes. And her writing was much admired, actually, by her family and her siblings, and she obviously was considered... they were all funny and witty and accomplished, actually, and I'm always very interested. So Cassandra was a visual artist. She was a great copier and drawer, and my colleague Janine Barches has been finding works by Cassandra that were, and the things that she was copying. And she's the only person we have the only drawings we have of Austen are by her. Not very helpful, little line drawings about the only one of Austen's face. I think she's pretty talented. Jane Austen was a musician. She played piano and she sang. And I do think it's worth... I always ponder on Sense and Sensibility, because Marianne is the musician and Eleanor the artist. So if we think Austen is having a good go at Marianne, she's perhaps laughing at herself a bit as a kind of romantic young woman, who likes sort of expressive music. So there's a kind of interesting thing going on in those arts. But yes, she was much admired, and I think generally, her father felt he was broken-hearted that the book didn't come out. I don't know whether they thought she was... It's not much opportunity for huge fame as a novelist in this period. Walter Scott's perhaps the only person who really makes it big. Maria Edgeworth too, but not a lot of room.
With La Belle Assemblée, was it a problem marketing a fashion magazine with a French name in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars?
It's a good question. It's again, I sort of spent most of my life thinking about my academic career reading works in French, which are widely circulated and translated through a century when England was constantly at war with French, with France. So I don't think there was. I think there's a kind of cultural cross-channel exchange. I mean, Voltaire comes to England and says, it's fantastic. The French context was very close to the Austens. People often sort of talk about them as though they were sort of in the middle of nowhere, but in the 1780s, I think it is, this cousin of theirs called Eliza de Fayed comes to visit, and she is married to a French soldier who sort of seems to have conned her, really. It wasn't a very happy marriage. Fortunately for her, he was guillotined. So,
That's a bit extreme.
which, I don't think she arranged it, which left her free to choose between the two elder Austen brothers, James and Henry, both of whom had fallen wildly in love with her. And she marries Henry, the banker brother, and she was herself a very accomplished harpist. People think Mary Crawford might have been based on her. So it was quite close to home, if you know what I mean. And again, I think they were a kind of interesting family. If you're thinking about the kind of political history of the period, the Austen family, one of, perhaps because they're a kind of not so affluent sort of vicar's family, one of the few families of this period who have no apparent investment in slavery, whose wealth doesn't come at all from, well, they didn't have much wealth, didn't come from slavery. I think someone's managed to find a few shillings that the father, George Austen, took from seems to have received as some kind of pension from a distant relative who had a plantation. But they were firmly, the whole family was firmly supporting abolition.
Well, I'm going to leave Ros to make some time to sell books.
Yeah.
She's modestly taken it off the slide that says what a good Christmas present it is. But I believe it's a very good
That's very
Christmas
exciting
present.
to
So
be promoted in such a way.
Do, if you'd like to come and get a signed copy or two of Ros's book. Next week, we're sticking with a home team. My colleague, Lindsay Clark, will be talking about Lindsay Jenkins, yes, Lindsay Jenkins will be talking with Sandra Fredman, Professor Sandra Fredman, who's the Rhodes Professor of Law and a very distinguished feminist scholar, and me and a barrister and trade unionist called Tess Gill, who brought a famous test case in 1983 about a wine bar in Fleet Street that wouldn't serve women. And it's going to be called I'll Buy My Own Drink. It's going to be a history of the first 25 years of the Sex Discrimination Act. And it's going to be fun, so please come along. But in the meantime, please thank you, Ros, for a fantastic talk.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.